Okay, hello, David, and thank you for being here for the interview.
Thank you, Joseph. Great to see you again.
So, David, you are an actor, you are a lecturer, producer, and most importantly, you are a writer of horror stories, The Hauntings of Elgin Barrett.
Yeah, that's right.
I'm a huge fan of this podcast. It's amazing how you tell the stories. So just a little bit about those stories. These are narrated stories about vengeful spirits and desperate souls, evil forces, and murderous cults of modern Britain. You have the podcast available on Apple, Audible, Spotify, Google, and other usual podcast apps.
Yeah,
and you also have a website, thehauntingsofelginbarrett.com. Anything you would like to add to your bio or perhaps your podcast, David?
I think you've got it all. Actually, I think that's all the information. Yeah. So there are, what have we got? There are 14, going to be soon 15 stories available on the podcast at the moment, and that number, with a bit of luck, will grow. So I think when your listeners hear this, we might even have a few more stories there.
Lovely, and I'm very much looking forward to the next installments. So, David, how did you come up with the idea for a podcast in the first place?
Well, it goes back to lockdown, really, for me, Joseph. Like many other people, I've discovered when was it, March 2020, that I suddenly and unexpectedly, I had nothing to do. I was working as a radio producer before that, producing mostly radio drama, which involved having lots of actors in very small studios, which obviously in the whole COVID thing we couldn't do. So that finished. And I was thinking, well, what am I going to do? And I thought, I'll do something I've always wanted to do with this unexpected gift of time. And so I thought I'd try and write a ghost story or a couple of ghost stories and see what happens. So I didn't start off trying to do a podcast. I just thought I would write some ghost stories. And then, having written the first ghost story, I wrote it in the first person, so it was a narrator. So it was a kind of dramatic monologue. And I thought, well, it would make sense to read it or record it or do something like that. And I contacted my friend, the sound engineer who I've been working with for years. And I said, I've got this story and I want to record it, but obviously we were all in lockdown, so I couldn't go over to his studio and do it. And he said, it's okay, I'll post you the equipment. So he posted me a microphone and a recording device and everything else that I needed. And I recorded the first story here in this room. It was so quiet. I'm in North London, so normally there are sirens and people shouting and everything else here. It was so quiet. It was like a studio. And so I could record the first story here. So I recorded that first story and thought, yeah, let's see if we can do something with this. And then that was when the idea came to do it as a podcast. Because I thought, well, if I had a few more of these stories, perhaps something will come of it. So it just grew. It wasn't a plan that I had in the first place. It was something that just came about through circumstance, really. Yeah.
I know you've written stories. You wrote stories before that. So how did it differ from writing, your original stories when you were writing a novel? How does it differ when you're writing stories for podcast, David?
Well, obviously, writing short stories is very different from writing for a novel. With podcasting, it's kind of different. I suppose that my podcast is not a usual podcast. I suppose I need to say that. In that most podcasts are 2 or 3 people sitting around having a discussion, a conversation about something. That's the normal format for a podcast. So actually having a podcast which is more of which is just reading a story is more unusual. Not very unusual. There are lots of other people doing it, but that's not the main thing about podcasting. But in terms of writing for a podcast versus writing for print, in a certain sense, one would say there's not that much difference. If a printed story is a good story, then you can read it and it will sound great to listen to. But obviously, if you are writing very much with the spoken word in mind, with a listening audience in mind, then obviously you write for a voice, so you're very clear about that. And I think which is a good thing. I think you become much more aware of keeping your audience's attention. I think, you know, if you just imagine your reader turning the pages and going through it, you probably won't be so bothered about having a 2-page, 3-page description of something. They'll think they'll enjoy this description. When you've got to read it to somebody, you become much more focused on grabbing the audience's attention and keeping it, and, you know, making sure that they're excited and engaged and thrilled right the way through. So in many ways, I think writing for voice and for listener is certainly it's a more challenging experience than writing for a reader, I would say. But in terms of anything being special about a podcast, I think probably that's not the case. You know, I mean, podcast, I suppose, differs from radio in that radio very much has disciplines of time about it. So when anybody who writes for radio are very used to writing for 15-minute slots, half-hour slots, hour slots, whatever it is. With podcasting, that's all out the window. You know, you can write for as short or as long as you possibly wish. So it's given a lot of people freedom. So people who have discussion podcasts can have big, lengthy, involved discussions in which you really get to know the interlocutors much more than you would on TV or radio. And I suppose with fiction, again, we've got the luxury of time. Although having said that, to be fair, I think that the sweet spot for a podcast, so I read somewhere, is somewhere in the region of about 40, 45, 50 minutes. Because apparently that is the average length of the American commuter's journey to work. And apparently the biggest audience for podcasts in the world are Americans in their cars commuting to the office or the factory in the morning. So
that's very interesting, David. So the length of the podcast is determined by the biggest audience in the US, correct?
Well, it could be. That's what I'm saying. It could be. I mean, I think there's nothing wrong. I mean, you know, those commutes will be all kind of different lengths. If you're enjoying something, you'll switch it off when you go to work, and you'll switch it back on again when you come back into the car and drive home, won't you? So, you know, it doesn't. But anyway, that's what people say.
Right. Well, I could tell you that when I was listening to your podcast, I was picking up my daughter from school, and I was driving a car, and I remember that it took me 20 minutes to the school and then 30 minutes from the school, and it was just about the right time. And I knew that when I was parking the car, I had still got like 10 minutes left of one of the stories, and I was just couldn't wait to be back at the flat to finish the story, because I had to, you know, then bring my daughter up, and it was just so frustrating, you know. So you know, 40 minutes, it could be, it depends on where you actually live, you know.
Yeah.
So for the listeners in the Czech Republic, I would recommend about 30 minutes.
Okay, I got it.
Anyway, David, so how would you describe your process when you are writing the stories for your podcast?
I try not to have a completely fixed process. Because I think it's helpful to do things in different ways, so that you have different approaches, you have different ideas and allow them to develop in different ways. Having said that, I suppose obviously initially you have the ideas for it, or maybe you have an idea. Again, that's something that is worth saying a little bit about, I suppose, the whole process of generating ideas in the first place. I mean, I'm someone who has always scribbled ideas in notebooks. So for my whole life, I've got stacks and stacks of notebooks all around me that I've just jotted down silly ideas and silly thoughts my whole life. And so when it came to writing The Hauntings of Elgin Barrett, I knew that somewhere or another in notebooks I had all sorts of little thoughts and little ideas that I could generate. But there's one thing, I suppose, having an idea, and the other that being an idea for a story. They're two different things. I think this is sometimes where certainly I've fallen down in the past, is thinking, I've got this great idea, but it's not an idea for a story. It's just an idea for for a scene or a character or an image. And for me, that doesn't make a story, even the short story. It needs to be developed in some way. So for me, a short story needs to be something like a mystery that you have to solve, or a journey that you need to go on that has a destination, or it needs to be some kind of revelation that changes a character and allows them to achieve an ambition or do something else, or do what they want to do. So for me, when you're having an idea, it's got to be an idea that actually can develop into a story. So I suppose that's the first thing I would do. In terms of then moving on to the process, I'm a bit of an obsessive planner. So I very much take the idea and then say, right, I need to break this down. I need to break it down into, people have different words for it, almost like, into 3 big movements, or, 3 turning points, or whatever you want to call it. My model of a story is always really, it's, you're in a situation, you've got a problem, a mystery, whatever it is, you set that up, and then you try, and you try again. And the try again gives you the 3 beats, the 3 movements of the story. So if you're writing a detective story, it's like someone is murdered, the detective tries to solve the mystery, they think they've solved it, but they've got the wrong person. So they go back and they try to solve it again, and this time they think they've solved it, they've got the murderer, and then it turns out the murderer's been killed. They haven't got it, and then they try for the 3rd time, and the 3rd time they try and they find the murderer. So it's try and try and try again, and I think that obviously that works very clearly with murder mysteries and crime thrillers and that kind of thing. But I think it works with almost anything. It works with love stories. 2 people meet each other, one person loves one, the other one hates the other. They try to get together, they fail, they try to get together again for another reason, they fail, and the 3rd time it happens and they get married and they live happily ever after. So I think stories, there's always that element of these 3 movements in every story, and I try to plan that out just in a very basic way to begin with, and then think about, if I've got say 3 different boxes, how can I make them different from each other? So the first part of the story is in one place, the second part is in somewhere else, so let's try and find different locations for them. One is in the city, one is in the country, one is at the beach, however you do it, so you have different locations for them. Then you think about, how can we make these characters interesting, how can we pull the characters apart and make them distinct from one another, and get them to react and interact with each other in different and engaging and exciting ways. So I think all that happens. So I try and do a lot of that in the planning stage. The problem, of course, with this approach is that sometimes you can just over plan, and you've got a plan that you really love, and then you think, do you know what? I can't be bothered to write this because I've done it already, So there's a sort of happy balance. You want to, you need to plan a bit, but not plan too much. And I then certainly will find that actually, once I begin to move away from the planning and actually start to write, then lots of the things that I've done in my planning actually start to change and evolve and move on. But I think what having a precise or a reasonably well-developed plan enables me to do is it enables me to go back and check where the story is, make sure the story's in proportion. So I think very often when you're reading a story or listening to a story, you begin to get the idea that actually it's just going on for a bit too long. Why is that happening? And for me, that very often happens because the story's not properly in proportion. The first part of the story, takes up half the story. The second part and the third part of the story, are all squashed. So I think getting things in proportion, again, for me, it's a way of just making sure that the reader is not bored, that things are not going on for too long. So I suppose that's the basic process is kind of, you know, idea planning, writing, and there's obviously then the rewriting process. And yeah, I'm one of those people that rewrites and rewrites and rewrites as I go, and then I finish it and I put it to one side, and then I come back and I rewrite it again, and then I'll ask other people to read it and give me a little bit of feedback if anyone can bear to do it. And obviously then I have an extra stage because I then record it. And obviously if you record it, you know, you're working with a sound engineer or actors, and just, you can just tell from their reactions sometimes, just, oh, this isn't working, you don't need that, and you'll make some more edits then. So it's quite a lengthy process from that point of view.
So if we go back to the beginning, please correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me that you are, at first you are inspired by some story or a scene, let's say, then you start putting it together, then you go into structure, you put it all together, you start what's the beginning, what's the end, what's in the middle, and then you start adjusting it, then you again maybe get inspired by some changes, and then you go through the process. So you are basically switching between the structure and being inspired. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think that's right. Yes. Yeah. I suppose in a certain sense, it's like a dance. One thing sets off the other. The structure will demand that you have certain ideas and certain thoughts, because you will see holes in the story because of the way the structure works. You think you need these ideas here, and then obviously also the structure will set off other thoughts that hadn't occurred to you before, which will. So yeah, it's like a dance where one side helps the other, I guess.
And sometimes you get frustrated by the structure, that you have it all in your head, and then you sort of, oh, I can't be bothered to write it. Correct?
Yeah, there is that about it. Sometimes you just feel that there is that sense, isn't it? Sometimes if you've really imagined something very, very clearly, then you feel it's done, or something in your subconscious feel, well, finish that. But actually, all it is just a pile of notes. You haven't finished it at all, but in your brain, something tells you, I've done it. Really, very odd.
So, David, your stories are horror stories. How do you get inspired to write these stories?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, in sort of the whole idea of inspiration is quite interesting, isn't it? I suppose that for me, when I think about inspiration, I sort of have an idea of a sort of poet, you know, wandering around in a landscape, and having wonderful ideas. And they just sort of drop out of the sky and fall into their heads, and and for me, that's not really how it works at all. I mean, I think on the whole, you know, the whole notion of having ideas, of the creative process, is something that you have to manage, and you have to go out and look for it. So, you know, in terms of having ideas, if you're not looking for ideas, you won't find ideas. Ideas very rarely come out of nowhere. So, you know, you need to find ways, I think, of seeking ideas. You know, so for example, very often I think that, you know, if I get stuck, I don't think I have any ideas. I ask myself, well, why is that? And very often it's because I haven't fed my imagination. You need to feed your imagination somehow. How would you do that? I don't know. I mean, you need in different ways. You read things, you talk to people, you go to an art gallery, you go to the movies, whatever you do, you feed your imagination. So you've got lots and lots and lots of rich input that your mind is processing. And so if you're doing that and you're actively seeking ideas, then you will find that some thoughts, hopefully, will start to come. So that would be my experience. I suppose there's also the other idea is actually recognizing an idea when you have it is quite an important thing as well, because I suppose also there's a great temptation when we think about ideas to think that the only ideas that are good ideas are the dazzling and completely original ones. Unfortunately, dazzling and completely original ideas are in very, very, very short supply. then there aren't a lot of them out there. And I suppose one thing that's worth remembering is actually the majority of ideas in any walk of life, whether it's creative writing or science or art or whatever it might be. I mean, the majority of ideas are actually very often actually just changing a few fairly small details in something that has gone before. I mean, that's how scientific progress seems to work. It's not that a scientist has completely invented something new. They've added added a few extra details to what was there already. Or, they've taken two ideas that are already there and they've combined them in a new and interesting way. So that actually, when we're talking about originality can very often, or perhaps always, be something that is already there. You're already looking at it. You just need to look at it in a slightly new and different way. Certainly in the case of writing horror stories, ghost stories, whatever. I mean, very obviously, I'm writing in a genre. I mean, this is genre fiction. And so that, we know that there are a number of set genres in this. There's the standard ghost haunting. There's the vampire. There's the poltergeist. There's the ghost that comes back from revenge. There's the ghost that comes to warn. There's the monster that destroys the person who created them, and so on. There's lots and lots and lots of these subgenres within horror fiction. So, the chances of coming up with a completely new subgenre within that are quite low. So that I think it's a matter of, obviously, one is trying to be original, one is trying to have new ideas, but it's about not being embarrassed about the fact that almost certainly somebody will have written something a little bit like this before you. And that certainly is the case in things like the horror genre or detective fiction genres. But I think even in other areas of literary endeavour, it's going to be the same. There are only so many stories in the world. What you're doing is you're giving them new twists and tweaks and having new approaches to them, I think.
That's a very interesting point, David. Basically, if I understand correctly, you are saying that it's okay not to be original, but to strive for, making it, adjusting it just in a new way, making the old in a new way. Am I correct?
Yeah, I think that's right. And which is not to say to be lazy. I think we should strive and struggle to create things that are new and dazzling and stunning and exciting. But it's also just allowing yourself the release of understanding that actually, all these stories in some way or another have been told somewhere before, and there's nothing wrong with that.
It's quite a common fear among writers and any artist maybe, that they are not being original, correct?
Yeah, I think it is. And I think you can also very often see that actually artists, writers, whoever are maybe trying just a little bit too hard to be original and just coming up with stuff that just feels a bit strained, a bit false, very often, possibly for that reason.
You mentioned earlier, David, that you like to be inspired by going out, by talking to people, going to galleries. So do you have any fireproof recipe how to get inspired to write a story? Is there a silver bullet for you?
No. I wish there were, damn it. But no. I mean, everybody gets stuck with ideas sometimes and thinks, no, I'm never going to have a new idea. Obviously it's just whatever works for you. I mean, for me, one of my favorite things to do is just to go to an art gallery with a notebook and just to wander around, just because it's and just to jot down words or thoughts or images or anything that just comes into my head, because obviously you are just exposed to lots and lots and lots of different thoughts and different ideas everywhere. And because you're in a gallery, you can just walk from one to another. You can spend as much time or as little time as you want with each particular idea. So I find that very helpful. I mean, obviously, if you're watching a movie, then your time is controlled by the filmmaker. But in an art gallery, you're in control of your time, so that you can afford to indulge yourself or not as you wish. But I appreciate that's probably just me. It might be the same for everybody.
David, do you ever suffer from a writing block?
Yes. Alas.
Very short and very short answer.
Yeah.
How do you deal with it?
Well, I mean, sometimes you just have to go through it. Sometimes you just are in a situation where you think, actually, I don't think I'm ever going to write anything again. This is awful. I mean, sometimes you do just get into those kind of situations, and part of it is trying to understand why. I suppose, why am I in this situation? And it could be, as we discussed, it could very often be that actually you're just trying too hard, that you're setting yourself a task which in fact is impossible. But then again, it's good to have challenges. So again, that's always a difficult decision to make. To say to yourself that actually you're trying too hard because you need to try extremely hard to do it. I suppose some of the things that I would say would be not always to do things in the same way. So I think there is a tendency, perhaps when you do suffer from some kind of writer's block, that the ideas won't come, the writing won't come, to actually say, okay, let's do it in exactly the same way as I did before. Maybe that's the reason it's not working. So maybe actually just do something different, just change the way, the process that you used to write. So I described a process that I used to write. Maybe if I had writer's block, I would need to actually just change that round, and I would need to actually begin by writing something rather than begin by having the idea. That's what lots of writers do. You can take your process and turn it on its head. The other thing I think is I've said this already, but is to feed your imagination. So feeding the imagination is very important. If you've got writer's block, it could well be that you don't actually have enough input. You don't have enough information, enough experience, whatever it might be. I think it's worth saying at that point that very often writers are told to write about what they know, and I kind of disagree with that, because I think that one of the wonderful things about creative writing is that it's creative. It's that you're allowed to use your imagination. You're allowed to make things up, and it seems to me to be an awful shame to tell people, no, don't make it up. Rely on your experience. But having said all that, there are times when you do need to go back to your experience. You do need to do a bit of research to actually get your brain functioning again when you're in that writer's block situation. Another thing I suppose I would say would be that rather than looking at writing as a process, think of it in another way. So think of it as a performance. So actually, if you're telling a story, well, actually, don't write the story. Actually, tell the story. Find someone. Find some poor, unsuspecting, patient person, and actually sit them down and tell them the story. So that you're forced to actually get the story out, and you can see their reaction. You can see how they react and respond to it, and very often just the other person's reaction will be a source of inspiration to you, I would argue. What else would I say? I suppose the other thing that I would say is that I think again, this is the notion of being hard on yourself. Actually, sometimes perhaps it's a good idea just to relax the inner critic a little bit, and just to say, yeah, don't judge it now. Just write it down. Just get the story going, get the piece of writing flowing. Don't worry whether it's good or bad. Assess that later, because it can be very, very hard to actually assess what you're doing at the time that you're writing. I find that I don't have the bandwidth to do that. It's too much for my mind to cope with very often. So I think those are probably my thoughts on that. I wish they always worked.
I found that the writing block is usually connected. It's sometimes connected also to inner critic, that you hear this voice in your head, oh, it's not good enough, it's not good enough, it's not good enough. You know, who's going to read it, etc., etc. So, do you ever suffer from having this inner critic? And if you do, how do you deal with it?
Inner critic, yeah. Horrible, horrible, horrible. I do hate the inner critic. And I must say, I do worry, because I know that there are lots of creative writing courses these days where they actually encourage the inner critic, that people are encouraged to actually write criticism at the same time as they're doing creative writing. And there must be reasons for this. I frankly, I don't know what they are. I think it's a really bad idea. Because I think the inner critic can be such a brake on your creativity, on your productivity, on your spirit of adventure. Dealing with the inner critic, I have just a little mantra which I say to myself, which I think I got from some kind of sports person. It's from a tennis player or a cricketer or somebody like that. What they said was, they said, you should practice with utter humility, and you should perform with exaggerated confidence. And I kind of quite like that. I like the idea. So if you take it out of the sporting context and take it more into a kind of writing context, it means that when you're practicing, or what does that mean? When you're thinking about your writing, when you're planning your writing, when you're having the ideas, when you're assessing it, it means be open, be humble, listen to other people, criticize yourself, think carefully about the pros and the cons, be humble. But when you decide to write, when you decide to perform, that's the moment when you behave with exaggerated confidence. Not just confidence, but exaggerated confidence. I know exactly what I'm doing now. Now I'm going to tell you the story, and I'm totally in control. And I found that quite helpful. I quite like that idea. Roger Federer with his coach, the coach is saying to him, work on your backhand, and he says, okay. And he takes those lessons. But then when he goes out on the centre court at Wimbledon, he is just totally the master of that backhand, totally in control of it. I wonder whether I found that helpful anyway, as a way of thinking about dealing with my inner critic. I don't know if anybody else would, but it kind of works for me up to a point.
Perfect. So let's leave now the writing block and the inner critic out and move on to something more positive. So okay. David, what do you enjoy most about writing?
Okay, I really enjoy just the thought of actually creating something that someone else will enjoy, I suppose, really. It's for me, I can kind of think of a story almost like kind of, shaping a pot on a potter's wheel, and watching the story come together and the shape and just imagining that other people are going to take a kind of a delight in the twists and turns of the story. They're going to be captivated by, they're going to be intrigued by the characters. They're going to, recognize the setting or enjoy it. So I think it's like, for me, that's the big thing. It's the idea of entertaining someone else. Really, I don't think I write primarily for my own pleasure. I think the main pleasure I get out of it is imagining someone else enjoying it. Obviously, as a writer, you very rarely actually see someone else enjoying what you do, but I enjoy imagining the idea of someone else enjoying what I'm creating. I think that's the main. That for me is the main pleasure of it. I suppose, I think there's also, writing is really hard. It's a really difficult thing to do, writing fiction. And there is a pleasure in attempting something really difficult, I think. It's like, why, I guess it's a bit masochistic, why do people run the marathon or participate in the triathlon? Why do people do these balmy things? But it's the same thing. Why would one attempt something as insanely difficult as, writing a novel? You must be mad. But there is a pleasure in challenging yourself to actually do something difficult. Particularly if, at some point you think that you've kind of completed it, you've kind of actually run that marathon, you've actually done it. There's a satisfaction in doing that. And I think there's also satisfaction as well as just having some kind of vehicle, some kind of vessel for one's thoughts and one's ideas and everything else. I talked about having notebooks full of kind of weird little phrases and strange little ideas and everything else. The idea that you can, all this madness that has been deposited, and that there is something you can do with them. There's a satisfaction, I guess, in that as well.
So, David, how did you feel first when you ran your first marathon and the first season of The Hauntings came out?
To be honest, I was absolutely bloody terrified. Not terrified by the ghost stories, but I found it really, really scary putting the podcast out there. And I think this might be something that actually is quite unique to podcasting, in that what it made me realize was that the whole publishing process that normally you would go through, normally you would write your story or novel, whatever, and other people would read it, and an agent would maybe take it, and the agent would take it to a publisher, and the publisher would take it to an editor, and it would go through all these stages until finally it was published. And I think probably what it does is it gives you as a writer, a little bit of a distance on what you're doing, because and also I think it's been validated by other people, so that if you go through a traditional publishing process, at the end of the day, it's not just your story. Other people have said, actually, yeah, we think this story is pretty good as well. So if it's published and it turns out to be rubbish, as the writer, obviously it must be pretty awful. But you do have some kind of support network around you. So it's not all on you. The thing I found with the podcast was that I realized that, particularly putting out things as mad as kind of ghost stories and hauntings and everything else, you think, these are actually quite bonkers. Am I going to put this out? Are people going to think, like, he's just gone mad? What is he doing? Foisting this nonsense, this rubbish on the world. Who does he think he is? and so from that point of view, I would upload the stories and I would send messages out to my network with friends and people and say, I've put this story out, and then I would just sit there thinking, oh God, no one's going to speak to me ever again. I've made a fool of myself. And thankfully, well, that might have happened, but if it did, then my friends and the people in my network were kind and polite enough not to tell me. so I've gone on with my madness in this. I suppose it kind of gets a little bit better as you go on, but yeah, it was quite scary at first.
So it seems to me that you are quite supported by your friends and your family in writing your stories and creating this podcast, correct?
Yeah, very much so. I've been really lucky. My family have come on board. Lots of my friends have come on board. People have been really, really, really kind in all sorts of ways. So that means my poor family has had to read my stories and tell me whether they're any good or not. But also friends, like I mentioned, my friend Malcolm, the sound engineer, has given enormous amounts of his time, his equipment, his skill, dedication to actually producing the podcasts and helping with all the technical aspects of it. Lots of actor friends have come in and read the stories for me and so on, which has been terrific. My daughter and her boyfriend, they did the website for me and the social media. You realize with podcasts as well, there's a whole lot of stuff that you need to do that I'm not a generation that's au fait with social media. Social media was something I really had to learn, so I was really grateful for my daughter Lorna and their boyfriend Jack for sort of helping me through all that and building the website for me, which is a fantastic website. I'm so pleased with that. So yeah, and then obviously when the podcast first started, my only ambition really was first of all to get it out into the network of people that I know. So there's a few people that I could send it out to and say, will you listen to it? And they were kind enough to listen to it and come back and say some nice things, which was great. That was really encouraging. And I thought, if I can get it out and they're okay with it, then maybe there'll be some kind of effect. Maybe they'll tell people, or maybe by doing a bit of marketing on social media, I can get a few other, and I can actually begin to push it outside my network a little bit. And I thought, if I could do that, then that will be a kind of a first level of success for the podcast, just getting it beyond my network. And I have managed to do that, which I'm really pleased about. But obviously, the first step is family and friends very much.
David, do you think that you would continue even, let's say, if you didn't have support of your friends and your family?
I think it would have been pretty difficult, frankly. Yeah, I think it would have been pretty difficult. It's quite, because otherwise, really, I would be a one-man band, and it's pretty hard operating as a one-man band. Frankly, it's hard to keep your spirits up. It's hard to keep your motivation going. So yeah, that would be tough.
David, if you allow me, if you indulge me and allow me one silly question.
Yes.
Are you ever scared of your own stories?
I don't think I'm scared of them, because I know what's going to happen, I suppose. I sometimes when I'm dreaming things up, I get a little kind of frisson as I think of the nasty jump scare that I'm going to impose on my audience. Sometimes I get a little feeling, and the hairs on the back of my neck just creep a little bit. So yeah.
No, David, this is another question which is sometimes unpopular, but
yeah.
Please allow me.
Yeah.
Who is your favorite writer and why?
Wow. I thought you were going to ask me something like this. I'm trying to think, who is my favorite? It's quite a tricky question, because actually I think I'm probably enormously influenced by the last person I spoke to and the last book I read. So it's all my favorite book is not always, but if it's been a decent book, my favorite book is the last book I read. So which in this case, I'll tell you, actually, I've got it here. The last book I read was the great book. It's called The Last House on Needless Street by a lady called Catriona Ward. It's a kind of horror. It is. It's really scary. It's set in the US. It's about a little girl who goes missing on the beach on Lakeshore one day, and about the man, the weird loner, who is suspected of kidnapping her. And it's just an extraordinary series of characters and relationships between them. I mustn't give too much away to spoil it, but there are all sorts of amazing characters, one of which is a cat. So one of the narrators is a cat that is telling the story. So anyway, I mean, that's the last book I read, which I just read last week. And I just blew me away. So I've got to say that, because it was just such an amazing book. In terms of short stories, I've been reading a brilliant Argentinian writer called Mariana Enriquez, this is her latest, Dangers of Smoking in Bed. Terrific short story writer. Again, she's kind of, they're not exactly horror, they're more kind of gothic, but they're amazing stories set mostly in her native Argentina. Not always, but they're terrific. Great. In terms of writers that have influenced me in the past, I mean, going back, I probably just talking about, I suppose, writers in the horror ghost story canon, if you like. I've spent, particularly over the last couple of years, I spent quite a lot of time going back and rereading classic ghost stories. So I particularly, there's this great tradition of the English ghost story, So we have, fantastic writers like M.R. James, I suppose, is considered to be the doyen of English ghost story writers. And there's a whole series of wonderful English ghost story writers. Equally Americans, people like Edith Wharton from that time, Shirley Ann Jackson from that time, or a little bit later. Terrific. More recently, people like Robert Aikman, Thomas Ligotti, obviously the fantastic Stephen King, are all short story writers that I'd strongly recommend. So yeah, they've all been influential on me recently. I suppose really because I've been looking particularly at the craft of ghost story writing and horror story writing, and reading those kind of people who have really mastered that craft, and looking at how they do it, how they put their plots together, how they create their characters. So yeah, those are the reasons, I guess, that I've been looking at those. And also, actually, there's one podcast actually I'd like to recommend on this score as well. There's a just if people listening are interested, there's a great podcast called the Ghost Story Book Club, presented by a guy called Adam Z. Robinson. And what he does in every podcast, he looks at a different ghost story, just a short ghost story, and discusses it in huge detail normally with a writer, a novelist or a horror writer, and they go through and they look at some of the classics of the genre, sort of ghost stories by people like Charles Dickens, for example, or by M.R. James, and analyse how they work. But that's a really interesting podcast for people to get into if they're looking at the nuts and bolts of how these things are created.
David, we are nearing almost the end of the interview, so
would
you be so kind and read or narrate a sample of one of your stories?
I will. Let me just switch over. So what I'm going to do, Joseph, this is a story which no one has heard yet. I haven't yet recorded this. But I'm actually recording it in a couple of days. So I thought, well, why not read you just the opening part of this? This story is called The Purgatories of Mr. Vine. This old chemist shop has been my entire world for longer than I care to think about. Day in, day out, I have sat here on this high stool in the dispensary, the shelves around me crammed with medicines of every description, tonics and tinctures, balms and balsams, capsules, pastils, pills and potions. There was a time when I could have given you chapter and verse on every one, dosages and risks, allergies, side effects, anything you asked me. But these days, I struggle to remember what any of the damn things are for. I look around me in despair, for all is in complete disarray. My dispensing bench is strewn with stopperless bottles and lidless pots, pot blister packs, half-squeezed tubes, open jars of crusting ointment. Behind me, the sink overflows with unwashed crockery. On the floor are piles of papers and prescriptions and unopened post. It is an abysmal state of affairs, but what can I say? I hold my hands up. I am a total disgrace to my profession, I know. And yet, all I do is sit here, locked up inside my head, the same thoughts chasing one another round and round, pinballing off the inside of my skull. How can this possibly be? How did I let this happen? Surely things cannot go on like this, surely not. And yet they do. Why does no one put a stop to it? Why do they not just come and close me down? There are times when I pinch myself, slap my forehead, command myself to focus, to think, to see, because there is an air of unreality about it. Could this actually happen to me? It is as if it is happening to someone else. But who? There is no one else for this to happen to. No one. I am utterly alone. I can no longer say when I was last troubled by a customer. I can't even remember when Mrs. Ruddock left, although it is now so long ago that I grow almost nostalgic for the woman. No, there is only me. So how am I to account for this? Did I bring this all upon myself? Is it simply the result of my own sloth and lethargy? Or is there more to it than that? Every hour of every day, I pick over the events that have led me to this pass. I go back through the same story again and again, the decisions, the mistakes, the chance events, but still I cannot decide whose fault it is. Is it really mine? Or is this all the doing of Mr. Derek Vine? You see, I really don't think it was meant to work out like this. I'm sure I must once have been a rather promising young man. I graduated from pharmaceutical college with a decent degree, and I had my sights set on a job in industry. The corporate sector, that was the thing, not the humble high street chemist shop. I remember I sent off applications to all the titans of big pharma, the clinical research labs, to government and industry. And while I waited for the job offers to tumble in, I signed on with an agency for work to tide me over. They offered the kind of jobs no experienced pharmacist would touch, last-minute cover for sickness or long, dreary late-night shifts. But that was no matter. It was a passing phase and I wasn't fussy. And then, out of the blue, they asked if I was free to do some locum work. The proprietor of a small shop on the south coast was going into hospital for a surgical procedure and needed someone to run the business while he was away. It was a month's contract, and as a bonus, it came with free accommodation. Spartan, I was told, but sufficient to my needs. I jumped at it. It was more responsibility than I ever had before, and I was sure it would stand me in good stead. In fact, I think I took the train down the very next day. But oh, how my heart sank when I saw the place. It was the dead end of a dying high street, a stuck-in-kind time of spot if ever there was one. The front door was flanked by 2 Victorian bay windows. No attempt had been made at a display. In one there was a set of weighing scales, in the other a dusty old carboy, filled to the top of its long neck with an oily orange liquid. The only hint of modernity was a security camera on a bracket in the porch, and on the fascia above it, in flaking gold lettering, was the proprietor's name, Derek Vine, Fellow of the Royal Pharmaceutical Society. I pushed the door open and inhaled that familiar chemist shop smell, the strange cloying blend of sweetness and astringency. The interior was as hopelessly antiquated as the facade. The wall on the left was shelved from floor to ceiling and sparsely populated by a haphazard selection of cheap consumer goods. There was a line of 4 scruffy kitchen chairs for consumers to sit and wait for their prescriptions. In the corner, an old Avery weighing machine, and on the right, a long counter cluttered with tatty point-of-sale displays. Chronic migraine? Bleeding gums? End the embarrassment. Tame your heartburn. Put a stop to the misery today. I shook my head. What on earth had I let myself in for? And only then did I realise that a pair of eyes was watching me. They were pale blue and unblinking, and set deep in a puffy pink face, framed by an electric frizz of permed grey hair. The owner sat perfectly still on a high stool next to the cash register, her bulk swaddled in a crisply starched white housecoat. You must be the locum, she said in a low Hampshire burr. Yes, I said, I'm Mr. Godfrey, Ben Godfrey. And I held out my hand. I'm Mrs. Ruddock, she said, and her eyes narrowed in instant dislike.
Well, I can't wait to hear the whole thing, David.
Is that enough for you, Joseph?
Thank you very much, David. So, what are your plans for the future?
Well, for the moment, I'm gonna stick with the podcast for now. I think there's a bit more mileage in it. So I'm recording this story this week. I've got another couple of stories that I'm working on. So there'll be a few more coming between now and Christmas or into the new year. And after that, we'll see what happens. I haven't got any thoughts beyond that at the moment.
Season 4, possibly?
It could be. It could be indeed. We'll see what happens. We'll see what happens.
All right. David, thank you very much for your time and the lovely interview.
It's been a real pleasure speaking to you, as always, Joseph. Thank you very much.
So good luck with everything, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing the next installments.
Brilliant. Thank you, Joseph. Great to
Have a
speak
good
to you.
evening, David.
And you. Goodbye.